Hello and welcome to the Sussex Festival of Ideas. I'm Ben Burbridge. I'm in the Art History Department at Sussex and part of the group who have organised the festival. We're in the Attenborough Centre for the Creative Arts, which is I'm trying to contain the excitement of being in a room with people, actual bodies in an actual space. So the event is being recorded and will be posted on the Sussex Festival of Ideas website after the event. Live captioning is available and can be activated by pressing the live transcript button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And we welcome your questions. If you put them in the Q&A, hopefully we'll have time at the end to put those to the panel. So in terms of today's event, with the festival, we thought we could do a number of things. One of them was to provide a space where we could draw together some of our existing partnerships, but also to develop new ones. Lots of the festival programme is based on research underway at Sussex, but we were also keen to create a space where we could facilitate or cultivate or nurture and extend conversations with people working far beyond the university. And that's the nature of today's event, where we're going to be reflecting on what potentially faces the UK cultural sector as it emerges from a long and difficult lockdown. The partnerships today, many of them are long established. They're organisations we've worked with many times in the past. Others, it's the first time for them to be working with Sussex, and this is a really exciting thing. I'll hand over very shortly to my colleague Flora Dennis. The only other thing I wanted to do is flag here that there is a companion project we've been working on, which is an artist commission, which is a collaboration with Photoworks. Shoair from Photoworks is on the panel today. This will effectively look to you, look to the public, look to the kind of various audiences and communities around Sussex to engage with and extend today's conversation. So we've asked some prominent alumni, Sussex alumni working in the arts, to formulate a series of questions that they would be interested in exploring in terms of the future of culture, what our organisations could or should be doing in the years ahead. They're going to be put out as a series of calls for short image and text-based responses, and through those responses we're going to generate hopefully an abundance of material, and we're really excited to be commissioning the collective Underexposed to produce a new artwork using those materials, which will be exhibited here at the ACCA in the autumn. So without further ado, I will pass over to my colleague Flora Dennis. Flora is a senior lecturer in the Art History Department. She also teaches on our Art History and Museum Curating MA. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben, and welcome to everyone here in person and also via Zoom. It's great to have a fantastic panel with us today, and it's really exciting, as Ben said, to have a sense of people together in an actual space, as well as having a hybrid event on Zoom. So I'll quickly go through our panel. I'll be introducing them fully before they give their short presentations. We have Joolia from Towner, we have Marina Norris, who has an organisation called Cultural Baggage, and also What Next Culture, Brighton and Hove. We have Nathaniel Hepburn from Charleston, Joolia from Audio Active, and Shoair Mavlian from Photoworks. And as Ben said, I'm Flora Dennis in the Art History Department here at Sussex. And for transparency, I should also add that I'm a trustee at Towner. So we have the following format: a series of short presentations from each of our panellists. Then we'll have a bit of time for discussion amongst the panel, and then we'll be taking questions. So if you're here live in the audience, please do jot down your questions for that point. And if you're following us via Zoom, then please put your questions into the chat, and Ben will kindly relay them to us at that point. So our first panellist to speak will be Jo Hill. So Jo is currently the director and the CEO of Towner Eastbourne, as well as being the co-chair of South East Creative Economy Network. And prior to coming to Towner from 2013, he was the director of Focal Point Gallery in Southend. While he was there in Essex, he was He led on the Radical Essex Research and Placemaking project, and he has extensive experience working as a director, as a curator, and as a project lead for visual arts organisations, public commissioning, and also working directly with artists. Joe.
Thanks, Flora. Well, as I say, it's very strange to be here speaking in person. I think it's been well over 18 months before I did a talk in front of any audience, never mind the audience here and online. But delighted to talk about the challenges, I suppose, and some of the positive bits about what's happened to the organisation over the last year. I think it is quite critical for us because I'm very interested in the role of museums and galleries and institutions like the ones we all run. And I think for the past 3 years, myself and the team have been really considering this question of what is the future of a regional museum and gallery. So in some ways, I think, there is a positive spin to some of the activities that have happened over the last year, in that it has given us a moment to really focus and to think about how these institutions can move forward. And I've tried to see it as a blank sheet of paper moment. And I know some of the colleagues around here have done similar things. It's a great opportunity for those things that you wanted to test and try to bring those into fruition. And I think this is some of the positives that we've been able to accelerate some of the work that we've wanted to do over a longer period of time into a short period through the closure and through the focus on issues like equity, on artist pay and things like that. And it's allowed us the space to talk and think about those things, which is quite rare within our industry, to get that space to consider those things. But there's no doubt that there's been huge impacts on the organisation, not only funding-wise, but morale and energy with the team and keeping staff in a positive place. Just a few practical things that we did. So we kept our programme and marketing teams active throughout all the periods that we were closed, and that was very much a deliberate decision, even though it took a financial hit on the organisation. But we needed to keep a connection with the audiences that we built such a strong relationship with. We did move some of our content online, but we did it in a slightly different way. We didn't want to just simply move existing content onto an online platform. We considered what content would suit that format. And the skills sort of growth in the team has been enormous over the period of getting used to activities like we're doing now and doing talks and events online. But one thing I was very keen to do was to be physical, do something physical with our audiences as well. So we produced a number of artists' material kits that we distributed through voluntary networks, the food bank networks locally, and refugee charities. And we were able to get arts materials to some of these more vulnerable households in Eastbourne and later in Seaford. And that was a small project to start with, but got such amazing response that has grown. And we've now distributed over 3,000 of these material packs. But crucially, it's created relationships that will be with the organisation for a long, long time now. And it's setting a sort of direction of travel for how we want to work through our learning engagement and our exhibition programme going forward. We had a very strange back end of the year as well, because we were actually nominated for Museum of the Year within the middle of all this, and were awarded it jointly with 4 other institutions. So it was quite, again, interesting moment to think about what museums are going to do after this pandemic. Some of the lessons that I've considered, I suppose, over the last sort of 12 months that I would take forward into how we develop the organisation is particularly around team communication. And it sounds weird to say that working from home has actually improved how we communicate. But the crisis and the need to respond quickly has meant that we talk more as a team than we ever have done. And I think that has really enriched how quickly we can respond to things and how quickly we can move the organisation forward. The peer support networks have been critical as well. A number of people around this panel here as well have been amazing supports on a daily basis, dealing with government guidelines, challenges, that sort of thing. And as I said earlier, just that time as a team to think about some of the critical crises that are now coming to the surface within the sector. Issues of equity and particularly of artist pay as well, and thinking about some of those things. So on the slides you might see some images of some of the online material that we've produced, and also some of the talk series that we engage with. And critically, that peer collaboration has become even stronger through this network. So we did a fantastic programme called Talking Loud, which was delivered in partnership with the Delaware Pavilion. And that was really trying to look at professionals within the sector, different creative industry sectors, and just to start to think about what are the challenges we're bringing into this pandemic and what are we taking out the other side of it. And I think those sort of collaborative networks will just continue to grow and strengthen over the next few years, hopefully. So what am I looking forward to post-pandemic? Well, I don't know when that'll be for the first answer to that. What I'm really keen to see is all of that learning that we've taken over the last year really being embedded in the vision for the next 10 or 15 years of the organisation. Thinking about how we can reinforce those relationships with some of the more vulnerable communities that we work with, and thinking about how we can grow the organisation in a sustainable and inclusive way. And I think there's been some really fantastic things that we've learned, and one of the things I wanted to talk about was sort of advocacy for the arts and for artists, because I think that what I've seen through the pandemic is a lot of our audiences and residents locally have sort of rediscovered the arts, rediscovered culture, rediscovered their local place as well, and that's started a new conversation for us as an organisation directly with our audiences. But there is a negative side to that, and I've seen all the brilliant advocacy work that we've done as institutions around thinking of how artists can be agents for change. That is leading to difficult conversations about how we best support those artists to do that in a sustainable way. Thinking about paying people properly. I am contacted daily about, can I get an artist to do something in the public realm here or there? Are you going to pay them? Absolutely not. And it's a real challenge that I think we need to focus on. Is we've done the advocacy and people are getting the message that arts and culture can be a change agent, but we're still not over the hurdle of doing it in a sustainable way. I think I better finish there. The last thing I wanted to say was about burnout. That I think the big challenge that we're facing is everyone is absolutely knackered. It's been non-stop for 18 months. It is absolutely exhausting, and I think considering mental health and really thinking about the team and how we support them to deliver the expectations we have with potentially less funding is going to be one of the biggest challenges we face as an organisation. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much, Joe. Our next panellist to speak will be Shoair Mavlian. She's the director of Photoworks and leads the strategic vision and the artistic direction of the organisation, including the curatorial, learning and engagement, publishing and digital content. Prior to this, you were assistant curator photography and international art at Tate Modern, where you curated exhibitions and researched acquisitions for the collection.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. Really great to be among such fantastic colleagues. I'll just contextualize a little bit by explaining a small kind of introduction to Photoworks. Photoworks is a small arts charity and not-for-profit. We were founded in 1995, so 2020 was actually our 25th anniversary. We were meant to have a really kind of amazing, massive party that will happen sometime in the future. But we've been around for quite a long time. But there's two things that make us quite unique, and I think really meant that we kind of went into the pandemic in quite a unique situation. So we're a non-venue organisation. We've never had a building. So we didn't have that problem of having to close down the doors and kind of shut everything off. So from that point, we were in quite an interesting position. We were able to react really quickly. We were able to be quite flexible in what we kind of did with our immediate response. And the second thing that makes Photoworks quite unique as an arts organisation is that we have a national remit. So although our offices are based in Brighton, we programme across the whole of the UK, and our remit is to champion photography across the whole of the UK. So we're already decentralized in the way that we program and the way that we think about our audiences. So a lot of our program is based around partnerships. So partnering with organizations that have venues across the country or internationally. So a lot of what we were doing in the early stages of the pandemic was really speaking to our partners and making sure that those partnerships, that there was kind of a reciprocal support system there for those partnerships. And a little bit more about our program, and I guess what we kind of did during the pandemic. We took the decision really early on to continue programming. So we didn't furlough any staff. We're a very small team, and we decided to continue our program, and that was really about continuing this kind of secular cycle of making sure that we were continuing to fund artists, that they were continuing to be paid, that freelancers were continuing to be paid. So really thinking about the economy of the arts and how arts organizations employ artists and really kind of help with that flow of economy through the arts and culture scene. And a lot of our program, it's based around this idea of giving opportunities for artists to make new work, make and exhibit new work. So we really just continued commissioning all the way through last year and still now. And I guess that kind of hits on your point of burnout. There really wasn't any stop for a lot of arts organizations. And then thinking about the challenges. Got the flyover, that's gone. Thinking a little bit about the challenges, we curate the Photoworks Festival, so it's the longest running photography festival in England, and it was meant to launch in October last year, so we very quickly had to decide what we were going to do with our festival and if we were going to continue. And one of the things that we did was we created this festival in a box. So we totally rethought our festival model. So we really spent lots of last year thinking about what are the traditional things that we do as an arts organisation, and how could this be an opportunity to really rethink a lot of those traditional ways of working and traditional ways of delivering programme. There's a few kind of key things in relation to the festival in a box. So our festival used to be called the Brighton Photo Biennial, and we rebranded it last year to the Photoworks Festival, and this was really about decentralizing the festival, so taking it away from a geographic location and really kind of unhooking it from a physical place, so really thinking about how our program could reach people that don't or aren't able to physically travel to a location to see arts and culture. The festival was sent all around the world, and it was installed in people's homes, in classrooms, in community spaces. And a lot of the idea of the festival in a box was really about handing over power to the audience. So as the director and curator of the organisation, we didn't really curate the festival at all. It was the audience that curated the festival, and it was all about giving people the agency and possibility to become curators and physically live with art and play with art in their homes and in the classroom. So that was kind of something that we did last year that we'll definitely take into the future. So I think a lot of the challenges that we faced, some of the solutions are definitely something that we'll continue on with our future programming. And then kind of finally thinking about moving forward and kind of the next few years coming out of COVID and the pandemic. One of the things that we did during 2020 was we looked again at our mission, vision and values. We rebranded the organisation, we redid the website, and we really looked at those values as an organisation and thinking about things like transparency, like Joe mentioned, and we decided to put all of those values online, and we decided to become as transparent as possible in terms of paying artists. So we publish our fees on our website of what we pay artists for all parts of our programme. And That's been a really positive thing in terms of how we're able to communicate and be really open with working with artists. It also faces a challenge moving forward. It obviously meant that we need to fundraise to be able to meet all of those obligations we've committed to. But that's really the way that we saw things moving forward, and in order to really be able to advocate for artists and support artist opportunities, we needed to really kind of commit to that. I think I'll leave it there.
That's great, thank you very much indeed. So our next panellist to speak will be Joolia, who's CEO of Audio Active, which is a groundbreaking youth music organisation that uses music for social innovation and grassroots talent development. Before Audio Active, Adam headed up the Inner City Youth Movement project in Nottingham, helping marginalised teenagers to produce, record and perform their own works. Adam is also founding director of Platform B Radio and an advisor to the PRS Foundation and the Cultural Learning Alliance.
Thanks, Flora. Hi everyone, thanks for having me along. Yeah, quite novel to again be in a room with people, but I think, you know, indicative of how we're going forward with it being a nice integrated event. So hello to everyone online as well. Yeah, I think I'll tell you a little bit about Audio Active before talking about the COVID context. We are a small music organisation. We work across Sussex and Brighton and Hove, and it's a young people's organisation. So we're working with young people, mostly teenagers, not so much at the primary age, right the way through to up to 25 years old. And we've got loads of different projects basically. They're all free for people to get involved in, but broadly they fit into two strands of work. One where we are just using music for music's sake, helping young people to follow an ambition to create music and making that as accessible as we can for them. We work mainly in black music and electronic music, and we've got lots of different projects right from entry level through to professional, so drop-ins where you can start from scratch, right up to professional artist development programs. We want to be able to help anyone who just wants to do it for fun, but also anyone who wants to take that as far as they can, to take it as far as they can, and we've had some really good successes along the way. I think on my angle, don't hold me to this, but I think there was a point about a month ago where Audio Active affiliated artists were at #1 in the singles chart and in the album chart concurrently. So for a small organisation, it's quite, I'd say we punch above our weight in terms of those routes through to industry. And then the other side of it is that we've got a lot of projects which are using music to tackle quite difficult societal problems. And that's things like Room to Rant, which is a mental health drop-in for young men, and they're using rap and spoken word, creative writing, working with professional artists and mental health practitioners to get stuff off their chest in a different way, really, to access talking therapy in a different way. We've got projects where we're mentoring vulnerable young people in quite a diversionary way for them to reduce their risks of becoming victims or perpetrators of knife crime. And we've got projects where we're trying to level up the quite heavy gender disparity in the music industry through female-led music tech projects for young women. That's just sort of scratching the surface, but I think I'll leave it there in terms of what we're doing. Before the pandemic, we were running anything up to sort of 50 to 70 sessions a week for young people and for emerging artists, and events and performances as well. And then all of a sudden it had to stop. We were in a whole new world, completely uncharted territory, and I think, you know, it's fair to say that when we all sat down together, at the time was a team of 5 at the start of the pandemic, and went, what do we do? No one knew what to do. It was obviously there were some ideas, but it was a slow process of every week realising there was a little bit more that we knew. But, you know, even looking back month by month, realising how much we didn't know at the same time. So it was quite a scary time, and a time that we needed to just be brave and do something, because quite luckily, you know, unlike a lot of the arts and cultural sector, we're not reliant on customers and audience for our income. We get our income through delivering impact for young people and for emerging artists. So the question really was, how can we carry on delivering impact? If we can demonstrate impact, then we'll carry on being able to get funding. So we didn't furlough anyone. In fact, we created jobs to try and, as an upfront investment, to be able to 6 months down the line say, look what we've done. We created we didn't have a comms and marketing department or any staff prior to the pandemic, and we created a comms role. We created a senior role to just basically be able to deal with risk and health and safety, so that we can get everything in place around the safeguarding, the COVID safety and all of that, to be able to work under exemptions that allowed us to work with vulnerable people to continue to deliver support groups. So a lot of what we were doing, we were able to take over to online, run sessions through Zoom and Discord and various online forums. But we also found that, you know, when we surveyed young people at the start and said, what do you want from us? What do you need from us in this time? They weren't asking us for how-to and for masterclasses. They were asking us for opportunities to connect, to collaborate, to just belong to something. And that was quite an interesting piece of learning, really, to look back at what we'd been providing to that point. And when people said, what do you do? We said, well, we teach young people how to make music. It's equally about, well, we give young people something to belong to. And that was quite a harder challenge, I would say, in the digital realm. Another challenge was that a lot of young people didn't have the just the nuts and the bolts to be able to join us online. They might not have had a device that they could connect or zoom in on a session with. They might not have had a space for any privacy at home to dial into a session. And quite often they didn't have, say, the internet as well. So we did a lot of fundraising around getting laptops. We actually got something like 30 laptops out of Gatwick Airport, and we were able to distribute some of those to families and young people so that they could plug into our offer. And we also sort of teamed up with other cloud-based platforms like music production studios, where you didn't need software on those devices and things like that. So there are various ways that we responded. And it actually paid off in the end. I think that we were able to go back to our stakeholders and commissioners and say, we're still going, we're still being able to deliver impact, be it to less people. We were still going. So, you know, we've grown during the pandemic from 5 staff to 9 staff. And I would say that some of the challenges that the pandemic's produced has also created some opportunities. So, you know, what I'm really looking forward to in terms of things coming out of the lockdown, being able to do things in real life in this kind of new world, are things like, you know, the pandemic's really created some problems, but also a lot of empty spaces. I think, Joe, you were saying it's accelerated a lot of the things that we wanted to do anyway. And if you look at things like conventional high street retail, that was on its way out anyway, not completely, but, you know, as e-commerce grows, retail and town centres are going to change and they're going to die back, and there'll be more empty spaces. That creates an opportunity. And I think what I'm really excited about is thinking about how the cultural industry can help provide an answer to that, because as shops retract and retail goes away, it's going to become residential. Town centres are going to become much more residential areas, and the people who live in them are going to want to plug into culture, right? They're not going to want to live in a graveyard. So I think all of a sudden local authorities are needing some solutions around that, and I think that cultural organisations can provide some answers there. We nearly out of time. I will hopefully get onto a bit more, but we're about to take over Dorothy Perkins' store in Worthing on the High Street. It might be good to get into that a bit later, but my point is, I think that there's a real opportunity for our sector here to sort of step into some of the gaps there.
Fantastic, thank you. We can certainly come back to that. I mean, it's really interesting how notions of kind of space and decentering and then kind of recentering in slightly different ways are emerging. Thank Thank you. Our next panellist to speak will be Marina Norris. She has her own creative consultancy called Cultural Baggage, great name. She's part-time executive director of Brighton People's Theatre, who co-create stories with communities across the city. She's co-chair of What Next Culture, Brighton and Hove, and is a trustee of Brighton Hove and Festival. And as well as that, she's also a co-fellow of Creative Partnerships and Community Engagement for this Festival of Ideas.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for inviting me today. It's brilliant to be on the panel, to actually see real people. Lovely to see you all here, and thank you to everybody who's joined us online. So I've got some slides to share. That's okay. Thank you very much. So if we can move on to the next slide. So I've actually listed the many jobs that I was doing in March 2020 because I just want to recognise that, like many people in this industry, I don't have one full-time job in the arts sector. And actually that does have an impact, I think, in terms of ways we work in the future, and also what we all recognise and learned over the last year was the difference between working in organisations and those who are freelance. So there are a list of things there that I was doing in March 2020, and some of them ended quite quickly, some of the work associated with them, others of them expanded. If we go on to the next slide, so what I wanted to talk about was not one organisation, but how, with my colleague Louise Blackwell, who is also co-chair of What Next Brighton and Hove, how we work with many organisations at looking at what was happening during the pandemic and how we might recover out of this. What Next is a national movement. For anybody who doesn't know, its role is to advocate for the role of culture in society, and there are chapters across the country. And in Brighton and Hove, we've got about 400 members. That includes organisations and individuals and people from all walks of the cultural sector. So what we decided to do was, within a week of the lockdown, the reason I said, should we just call a meeting, actually? Should we just see who wants to turn up? And I think there were about 30 people when we set up this meeting. And it was really clear right from the start that we had a really extraordinary range of people there, people who were one of the biggest arts organisations in the city to individual young freelancers. And we decided we just needed to start asking what were the issues, what were people concerned about. And immediately, of course, we had freelancers talking about the fact that they had lost 100% of their work. We had project-funded organisations who were concerned because they couldn't deliver their projects, whether they would be in existence by the end of the year. And of course, we had all organisations kind of concerned because it was unpredictable. We didn't know how long this was going to go on for. So we decided very quickly that what we would do was gather as much information, and this was happening across the sector because it is an ecology and lots of people are doing brilliant work at gathering information, and we started to do that locally. Brighton and Hove, the economy is made up of 30% is based on the events industry. So it was a huge impact when live events couldn't happen to the city. And we started gathering information and using our access to basically our political access to wider networks to share this information. What Next nationally is very well connected into government, and they were holding roundtables and able to share information being gathered. And I do think it was a kind of act of kind of lobbying and advocacy that did lead, for example, Brighton and Hove Council made a decision to prioritise creative and cultural organisations in its emergency funding. And I think this is an example of how, as a sector, we started working together and creating a voice for us. And actually, we haven't really done that as well locally as we could have done maybe for many years. So this was there were some really positive things here that were happening just by the fact we were gathering. But we also knew not everybody could be in the room. And I think that's really important to say, that other people were saving their organisations, didn't have the time for this. So we also tried to take a sense of responsibility for those who couldn't be there as well. We invited speakers and tried to create a space where anybody could kind of share what was of concern at that moment, and we brought funders in to try and share information. And one of our members sent a statement in. It was a week after George Floyd's murder, and it was about Black Lives Matter, and actually a real recognition and a reminder to us all that we may have been in a pandemic, but we were also in an ongoing crisis of social injustice. And in terms of the arts and culture, about representation, that we were still not representative, that we were still not fully representing the wide culture of our country. We weren't diverse, our voices weren't diverse enough. And there's a big question then at that point about what are we advocating for? Are we advocating to keep everything the same? Or what were we going to do to re-emerge differently out of this pandemic? Go on to the next slide. Alongside this, there was another group forming in the city called EPIC, and they were a group of commercial event providers. They did everything from provide security to staging to running commercial events in the city. And we were brought together with them and with the Arts Commission, and there was a proposal to think about what could we do if we looked at recovery collectively, because we could reach a huge amount of people. So we raised money by the Arts Council and the Council, and we brought a diverse range of facilitators to facilitate 2 weeks of 17 sessions, over 100 people attending a discussion. We wanted as many people as possible to be able to feed into what recovery could look like and ensure that it was as inclusive as possible. It wasn't a perfect process, but we did end up with 5 strands of activity, which I'm not going to go into today, but they cover some of the things that have been talked about today, partly, things like Enliven, which is a strand about looking at the city centre and how can culture help. The visitor economy, but also the real rewilding of the city centre, I heard, which is a great expression, isn't it, about what city centres could look like in the future. So there are 5 strands to that activity. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. And in terms of what we've learned, well, if you want to change the story, you do have to change the characters who are involved in the story. And that's not just adding inclusion on the side, it is literally about taking a step aside and looking at power dynamics that exist and what we need to do differently. This is an opportunity for us all to emerge differently. We also learned that as a country, we don't actually understand how to fund the cultural sector properly. We still don't understand the freelance business models that exist and how much and how important it is to distinguish between funding organisations and individuals or small micro businesses as well. We learned of the generosity of each other and the amazing people that came together, and that we actually could be far stronger if we came together. We could work differently. There are so many ways we could do things differently. We don't need to keep replicating as small organisations what we're doing. So again, that requires more generosity moving forward. Old habits and power dynamics die hard. That was another thing that we did learn, and we did have to recognise that they do exist. And to challenge, but also acknowledge that they exist, but to keep challenging. And that took some things longer than I think we thought they were going to take. And it did also contribute to, as Jo talked about, some of the burnout that was experienced. We can move on to the next slide. What I'm looking forward to is we have a plan. We are raising funding for it. I'm actually looking forward to the impact of that, to be able to create more jobs for people in the city, to create work happening outside the city centre for communities, to increase the training and knowledge in the industry. And hopefully at the end of this month, we should have a little bit of news towards that. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And in terms of forward, oh, I'm so sorry. I will very quickly. We mustn't bounce back. That is my call to action is let's not do what we were doing before. And I'm just going to say something very quickly about the slow arts movement. Slow art movement is something distinguishable. It's about slow art appreciation. But I've been thinking about the slow arts movement, which is basically responding to the same way that the Italians did about slow art, about slow food movement in the 1980s. Which is where if you replace the word food with the word art, I think we can learn a lot. The pleasure of art with a commitment to the community and environment. And for me, there are 2 really important words: slow. Let's not keep trying to overproduce and be overproductive for less money. And commitment. Let's have real commitment to communities, because actually, as a result of being slower and this commitment, we will create less damage to the environment.
sorry at all. Fantastic. Thank you very much. There are lots of things that I'm sure we'll come back to. Our final panelist to speak will be Nathaniel Hepburn, who is the director and CEO of Charleston. He joined Charleston in 2017 from Ditchley Museum of Art and Craft. And over the last 3.5 years, Nathaniel's been leading the organisation through the transformation of being a historic house to becoming an interdisciplinary cultural centre, focused on the pioneering ideas of the Bloomsbury Group, who made Charleston into such an important modernist home.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I've just been to start off with, I was nervous that I was going to be last, and you kind of build nerves. I've just been listening to amazing leaders talking about their organisations, and it's fascinating. And it's a real pleasure and honour to be here. So I think Charleston was in a very different place this time last year. We were at critical risk of insolvency the day we had to close. So we're funded, 88% of our funding comes from people walking through our gates, buying tickets to events, buying tickets to the house, buying tickets to galleries, and buying from our shop and cafe. So as soon as that hit us, we were faced with having to raise something in the region of £500,000 within months. And actually this time last year, I think pretty well to the day, was our drop dead date, which I learned is the point a charity becomes insolvent and is unable to meet its obligations. And so we were on the government's heritage at risk register, and this was a point before philanthropy had kind of realised the severity of the risk to the sector. It was certainly a long time before the government launched its Cultural Recovery Fund money. And there was this kind of gap while there seemed to be a game of chicken between government and philanthropy as to who was going to step in. And there wasn't really an understanding of the scale of the problem, because as colleagues were saying, we didn't know how long this was going to last. And every week that went by, we were seeing the amount that we needed to be able to survive as a charity just increased. But I'm still here, and we're all still here. And I think the severity of the situation for Charleston opened up some opportunities for us. And although our independence as a charity, I think, made us most vulnerable, it also allowed us to be most agile and to change and recover. And to Marina's point, not to bounce back, to kind of bounce forward and in a different direction. So we had to make some big decisions, and one of those was, against all of our PR advice, was to launch an emergency appeal at a point when, you know, there was a serious health crisis and everyone was scared. And Charleston's an amazing place. I think it's magical, but it's a lovely painted house. And when people are dying and when our hospitals are full, launching a fundraising appeal to save a lovely painted house is a real challenge. But we had to do that. We had to do it quickly. And that gave us the opportunity actually to be one of the first organisations globally to start articulating the severity of the problem for culture. And we received a significant amount of press coverage around that. We also made the decision very early that we would stay closed, that whatever else happened, our visitor numbers were not going to be recovering. And I think some of my colleagues looked with envy about the fact that we weren't doing that kind of week on, week off decision of, are we opening? Are we changing our program? When are we going to open? What are we going to do? When are we going to bring staff back? And we just made that decision very, very early that spring 2021 was when we were going to reopen. And it was a difficult decision. Furlough hadn't been extended at that point. We still, so we had to make a significant proportion of our staff team redundant. Almost all of the staff were on furlough throughout the whole of this as we were seeking to think about how we would recover and to raise the money to do so. But that decision to stay closed allowed us to focus our time and energy onto thinking about what we would reopen as. And actually, we put together this kind of 18 kind of point thing to say, if we can do these things over the next year, we'll become an organisation much closer to where would otherwise have taken us 5 years, 10 years to have become. And to accelerate all of that, to just focus on that. And focusing on that long-term vision was something that was kind of scary to do, because we didn't really know what next week looked like. We didn't really know that we could survive as a charity, but we had to believe that we would, and we had to believe and articulate what we were there for and why we had to survive. And so that long-term vision alongside that helped us secure amazing donations. 2,673 people around the world put their hands in their pockets to support Charleston and ensure that we survived. We had amazing donations like a guy called Norman Coates, who gave us 422 of Duncan Grant's previously hidden erotic drawings, which is a huge gift of confidence in our ability to survive and go forward. And we wanted to make sure that we came back more beautiful, older, more connected to our communities, more resilient, more efficient, and that's what we've been doing over the last year. In terms of lessons that we've learned, my kind of first draft of this was like, I should probably talk about digital and the importance of digital. But to be honest, there are plenty of people in my organisation and in other organisations that are much further along on that journey than I am. I want to get people into our organisation. I want to put people in front of artwork. I want to put people in our courtyard listening to music. I want to get people into face-to-face, ear-to-ear contact with culture. And so I'm not going to answer that. Others can talk about the importance of digital audiences mattering as much as physical audiences. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about actually stakeholders, and I think a really important lesson, and it's not a resolved one. We're having this conversation actually kind of in the middle of a lot of this, but I think it ties into a kind of bigger conversation about those that shout the loudest and not always those that articulate the majority perspective. And there have been loads of heroes for me in the pandemic, whether that was like our gardener cutting flowers from the garden and taking them to a local shop that was selling them for donations for the charity, or the staff taking furlough leave as their kind of sacrifice for the organisation, despite the fact that they wanted to be working, they wanted to be part of the people saving organisation, like public servants at DCMS, Alva, Heritage Lottery, kind of working to advocate for this change. So lots and lots of heroes. But I think I'm going to just talk briefly about three. One is a woman from somewhere in Europe who gave a donation of £7 to Charleston. And that donation touched me more than many, many others. It just felt like a really precise number. Like £10 was probably more than they could afford to give. But they had never visited Charleston. They gave because they wanted to know we would be there to come back to. And that was very, very moving. Emily Moore, a local artist, illustrator who was on furlough leave and decided to start raising money and set up this Instagram auction that raised £55,000, artists donating their work. And there was a kind of huge buzz of energy and excitement about that. And then also we established our diversity, equity and inclusion group towards the end of last year. And it was very humbling to reach out to our communities and for people to apply in their dozens to say, we want to help Charleston on a journey of change. And to hear their life stories as to why they felt that they could support that change process. And why am I sharing those people? Well, any other time, those voices wouldn't have been heard. People would not have lifted their heads above the parapet. And actually, they would not have left that kind of TripAdvisor comment or put some angry thing on Twitter or lent to one of our trustees and had a word over a dinner party. These were different voices, but Charleston was as important to them as those people that would be our more vocal supporters or critics. So what I'm going to take away from the pandemic is that sense that a deeper conviction that Charleston and culture matters to huge parts of our community every week of the year, but we don't always hear those voices, and that it's our jobs to really amplify those quieter voices. So what am I looking forward to coming out of lockdown? As my slight amount of sunburn might show, I'm looking forward to staff meetings, to meeting my team, spending more time with them, going to the pub after work, the biscuits you get at conferences, having coffee in the garden at work with colleagues, drinking that really horrible warm white wine at Private Views that makes you feel a little bit ill. That's what I'm looking forward to kind of our communities and our contacts and our colleagues coming back together like we are today. The main challenge is absolutely going to echo exactly what Joe said. Finding a space to breathe. This is not, it's not stopped. We're still not stopped. And looking after our own mental health and our team's mental health is going to be that really, really big challenge. But to Marina's point, the generosity of the sector and our colleagues is what's got a lot of us through this. And so I'm sure we will do that.
Great, thank you all very much. There are many strands that I think we will clearly pick up and discuss further, but I would like to thank you for reflecting so kind of openly and honestly about challenges and opportunities in the ways in which the organisations you work with have responded. What's very clear from all of you is that you have been provided with a moment which has allowed you to step back and really reflect on the kind of fundamental purpose of what you do and how you do it. And I think there are many facets of that I'd like us to talk about. The first is, I was very struck by this idea of decentering. Decentering in terms of physical spaces, how that plays out when you didn't have one to start with, but you're still having to deal with issues of decentering, also in terms of perhaps what we would think of as expertise in the cultural sector, and how you can start that process of listening in different ways to the people who are engaging with your organisation. So I wonder if we could start with that issue, if any of you would like to start by speaking to this notion of decentering as you're building forwards as opposed to bouncing back.
I don't like that.
Thanks, Joe.
I mean, I think for us, as I said at the beginning, we've been trying to decenter the idea of the building for the last sort of 3 years and get away from this notion that the building is the be all and end all, the asset. And, I'm particularly interested in institutions like Towner that were built in a wave of sort of investment in the cultural sector, and were used as vehicles of sort of culture-led regeneration. We're all sort of architect-led sort of standout buildings that were commissioned pre the financial crash in 2008 and delivered after them, with these huge expectations that they were going to transform these towns that they were built into. And I think, speaking to fellow directors that run similar scale organisations like Turning Contemporary, Hepburn, I think the learning over the decade of these institutions has been about getting away from the notion of the building, being about the building. And I think that's been a journey that these institutions have been on. We've done that over the last 3 years and then accelerated that even further through the pandemic because there was no building. So we had to think about how we could, well, I suppose we're doing a strange thing in that through our vision change, we're grounding in place, but we're also decentering to think about a whole town rather than a single building, but also at the same time thinking about that building being more of a social space, a safe space for different groups, different activities, not necessarily simply looking at art, but being there for lots of different purposes. So it's that sort of triangle of how you map all of that. And I think just the building element being taken away has helped to sort of really focus how a roadmap might do that over the next few years. The challenge, which I wanted to echo from Marina's points, were that one of the big things was how do we maintain, and that's Shoair, you said as well, how do we maintain the ecology of all the surrounding artists and freelancers that are working with the organisation. And I think through doing projects out and about and online, and we were able to continue some of those strands of programme and be investing in research for the future, which might be about activity taking place in Lewis or New Haven or out in the community in Eastfield. So.
And I guess, for Photoworks, this idea of kind of decentralising has always been at our core because we've never had a physical space. But what the pandemic allowed us to do was really think about who our potential audience could be. And really think about, it's not just the people who can reach a venue or a physical location, it's really anyone across the globe that has access to connect with us. So it was really thinking about those new possibilities and then also really listening to that new audience and then making sure that all of that feedback kind of is then taken into where we go next as an organisation.
I'm interested in also it's a really interesting word, actually. I've not thought about it before, as context, but actually about decentering from your organisation to look at kind of what impact what are the issues that we're all facing, and what can we do if we don't try and solve them alone, but decenter ourselves, our organisation, and place ourselves collectively, looking at what impact we want to create collectively and what issues we are dealing with locally, nationally, globally. And I think that was something for me, that is what happened through this process, but it wasn't always easy. And at one point, when people came together to share ideas, before we did that, somebody did say, well, what if one of my ideas ends up somewhere and it's my idea? And we decided to talk about Creative Commons, which is how we did so we used the Creative Commons license. Because effectively said, well, if we're coming to a shared space to look at the impacts and issues, we can't own any ideas as individuals or as organisations. So I'm sort of interested in that as well, about how we might do that more as a collective of organisations.
I wondered if you wanted to say something, given that you're about to kind of recenter or have a different relationship with this.
Well, I've got a couple of things. One of them's more actually in Marina's realm and what she was talking about, which decentering and sort of breaking down of power structures. But it's interesting hearing you all speak, because we've kind of been on a journey for the last few years towards centering, in the sense that, and I'm just sort of wondering about the slight difference in context at all, that, you know, we occupy a space where we span 3 or 4 sectors equally. So we're not youth work, but we do a lot of youth work. We're not arts development, but we do a lot of arts development, community safety, education. And I think my angle on that is that actually when you look at what's happened in the youth sector over the last 10 years, 70% of what they used to be in terms of infrastructure and funding for youth services has gone already. And I suspect that might be why we've kind of like chosen to start moving towards places and buildings. But something that stays with me a bit is that before this all happened, we were geared up to be going into not a major capital project, but a permanent one that would have seen us set somewhere up for, you know, for not less than £1 million, that would still have to be there in 10 or 15 years' time in terms of all of the agreements. And what I've learned at this point, and I don't know whether that's where I'll be in a year, is that I don't want a permanent home anymore. I'm much more interested in, you know, and it ties into what we're talking about here of being sort of fleet of foot, adapting to what's going on out there in the landscape. And I suppose that builds into the resilience of it. So I don't know where that sits with the whole centering idea, but I quite like temporary centres in the sense that's where we're at, and the space that we have in Brighton, the space that we will have and that we're working on in Worthing. They're all meanwhile projects, and it's something I quite like about that.
And those presumably are allowing you, a lot of you were talking about connecting with the communities that you've already got good relationships with, as well as using different forms of interaction to develop new community relationships. And I suppose it's about what's going to support that connection, which is so important for you.
Well, I just ask Adam about space, because I mean, it's great. I think it's great, the idea of this Dorothy Perkins and, you know, moving into that retail space. Do you have concerns though that there is the cultural sector has been looked to as an answer to sort the high street out, but not being resourced properly? Because that's something that I've certainly noticed, is that there is a feeling that the cultural sector could use these spaces, and they could be used really brilliantly, I think, by artists, by makers, by creative industry specialists. But there seems to be very little support for actually resourcing that, because there's a huge benefit to that town, that place, that institution being there and using that space and driving the footfall to the high street.
I think it depends what perspective you look at it from. Like, if there was a serial commercial entrepreneur in this panel, they wouldn't necessarily look at it from that angle. And I don't think from what everyone said that there's a single person here now who wouldn't say that their organisation or them as a profession is not more entrepreneurial now than they were a year ago. So I think when it comes to spaces, it's about how you look at those spaces as a way of developing a viable business model. And yeah, but but there is certainly, controversial as it may be, I think there's certainly big chunks of ours from generalising, but of the cultural industries that are too reliant on funding and get complacent because of that ease of regular funding as well. So I don't know, a bit of both there, but I do think that what has required us to all still be going throughout this and come out the other side of it is quite entrepreneurial approaches, and actually I think more of that is only going to make us more resilient. And sort of asking that question of, well, actually, what does the world look like without the funding structures, and how are we all getting along within that world, or how would we be getting along within it? Just to play devil's advocate.
I think I agree that I suppose the challenge I've seen is that the creatives are always brought in very late in the conversation. It's not like they're asked to be part of how are we going to rethink this high street. It's like, oh well, they'll deal with all these empty spaces. And what we've thought of the strategy, and we've spent, if there is any money or any money on X, Y, and Z.
I do get your point though, in terms of, and it ties into what you were saying about when someone asks you for getting artists to do a public commission without any pay. There's definitely an undervaluing of the value of the professionalism and value of artists' work and creativity in general as a really equal agent for change and contribution to society. I think that there's still that, we're still dealing with that issue. Yeah.
Sure.
Because it's creative.
Yeah, just in response to that, Photoworks is leading a consortium of 10 partners across England, commissioning artists, working with Historic England to commission artists on the high street, and to work with communities to help ask those questions of what we want the high street for, how can we use it, how can we make this transition something that's more community-led. So there are definitely kind of things that are happening, and that's a 3-year program. So we're just starting that now, and that will run for the next 3 years.
It's a similar process that happened. Well, my nervousness is a similar process that happened with the school curriculum. Oh, arts and culture can fill the gap that we don't do in the school curriculum. Oh, the high street, we can sort that out with arts and culture. It's just a nervousness I have about how well that is supported, not necessarily financially resourced, but just supported actually as well.
In terms of space, I think absolutely we exist because we have a building, and our building is our whole purpose. But like Shoair, the organisation has gone through a process over the last year of looking at our vision, looking at our mission, looking at our values, and actually that idea of Charleston as a set of ideas that can happen anywhere. Charleston is about thinking about life differently, thinking about society differently, and the role of art in doing that, role of creativity in thinking about society differently. So I think we have also done that same thing of going, we know the site is really, really useful. We know there are huge audiences that still don't feel welcome and feel that the site is accessible to them, and a huge amount of work saying, well, there's no point in having a building if nobody comes. I mean, obviously people come, but there's no sense, as long as, until everyone feels able to come, then there's a limit to the purpose of the site. But alongside that, thinking about what does it mean beyond our walls, beyond our site, and if we wanted to reach, we do want to reach into communities where travelling out to our remote rural location is just not an option, then how can they experience Charleston? And that's of course early stages of a big bit of work for us.
Yeah, just want to say sort of another hat on which my Brighton pupils say so hat on. First of all, I certainly don't actually think any arts organisation is the building, it is the people within it and the culture that's created within that space. But from a Brighton pupil perspective, we work with communities actually that are not in the city centre in Brighton, and actually there is something really about the physicality of decentering. It's as simple as just not seeing ourselves at the centre of everything that people should come to, that actually we're really liberated by the fact that we don't have a building, that we go to the communities to build, and we work with different communities that wanted us there as well. That's another important factor, actually, why you want it. But it is to build relationships with communities kind of outside. I think there's something literally about the physicality, decentering, not placing art at the centre of not assuming that art should be at the centre of every city. It needs to be there, but we should also be in every part of it as well. And those dialogues need to be ongoing, and actually the communities need to be at the centre of that.
Another word that came up was transparency, transparency and advocacy. And you talked about existing structural inequalities that everyone's trying to deal with, to get to grips with, to actually make real change. I wondered if that notion of transparency, whether it's how you work, whether you pay artists or freelancers or the people who are serving coffee or manning your shops, alongside issues of who is actually coming to your organisation, who are your trustees. How are you dealing with that alongside everything else, and how are you holding yourselves accountable?
I guess I can just start really quickly, is that when we were kind of rebranding and thinking about our mission and vision and values, we really it was an opportunity to decide how we wanted to spend the money that we had. And that was a really important decision to make, as directors, as organizations. It's our decision how we distribute that money that we fundraise or that we get from the funding. So that was a really big thing, and we just decided as an organisation that we were going to prioritise paying artists, even starting at a very, very low level. We had to start somewhere, and once we set those ground rules and made it very, very public, that enables us hopefully to build on that and move forward. And part of that was also me publishing my own salary on our website. That must have been a kind of bold, brave thing to do. Did that feel difficult? Was that something you discussed with your organisation, or why you did it? Yeah, we discussed it internally. And I think coming from Tate, everything at Tate is essentially public knowledge if anyone wants to do a Freedom of Information Act. So I was very used to that idea of actually, it's just better to say it because someone can find out anyway.
Yeah, Marina.
Yeah, with the what next with the programme of work around recovery, we right from the beginning, so we had to be transparent about the process and about fees, and we were all doing this voluntarily until we raised the money, and then the founders who were freelance did get paid for that. So we also shared that, we shared budgets at every stage with people, but we also kept the communication going throughout as much as we could, so that people knew where we were, why things were being held up, what decisions had been made, who was making them. And I think that was a really important process for us to do. At times, though, it's easy to forget about that. And it's not just transparency isn't one moment in time, it's a kind of ongoing way of working. So I think that was something that I certainly learned about that. And with Bright People's Theatre, when we got some recovery funding, and we were really clear about what we were getting that for, what we were going to do with that. I think we probably all have some work to do around this, though, don't we? And when I was recently on a session talking about freelancer fees, and realising actually how many of us who do have freelancer hats on as well actually have had to call each other and go, what do you think about this as a fee? Because there isn't necessarily a case, there are some unions out there, but it isn't like that. It's like Wild West when it comes to kind of things. And sometimes you just respond to what the fees advertised as. So I think there's something there for me about actually understanding freelancer fees and business models. And that's an open conversation with organisations and amongst freelancers. And I think we need to have it, because I also think some people are heading into poverty if we carry on paying at some of the rates we're paying.
Yeah, I think that's about what we pay our staff as well in organisations, and I think that there's a huge amount of work that the sector needs to do around that. We still have a long way to go until the organisation is properly sustainable. because that is not sustainable and the staff are not paid enough, because we're taking for granted a huge amount of love and passion that means that they start work at 7 o'clock and finish at 7 o'clock.
And volunteers, we haven't even mentioned the idea of voluntary labour, yes. Yeah.
So I think that transparency and that openness between organisations and publicly around actually what is the right thing to pay artists, freelancers and staff teams, part of that process as well.
I mean, for us, I suppose it's about, I mean, you talked about transparency and advocacy as well. And I suppose it's about recognising the responsibility we have to be looking after not just the survival of the organisations, but like you say, the people who work, the organisations are the people who work for them. Massive part of our workforce, the majority of it is freelance, in that we've got, you know, now we've got 9 staff and something like 35 artists, regular artist practitioners. Most of who are professional musicians, most of who lost 100% of their gigging income overnight. And I suppose, to give an example, we didn't tap into any cultural recovery funding or the emergency funding. We did get a bit of funding from Comic Relief, who was one of the funders of our mental health projects. And I think that was about, you know, using that to try and protect artists' livelihoods as well. And as well as paying artists for work that we wouldn't normally give them through other stuff. I mean, to give an example, we've got a space down the road just by the petrol station down on Lewis Road. And within that space, we've also got 6 professional artist studios that are occupied by artists who work for us. And as well as sort of giving them just without the pandemic, about 50 or 60% remission on what that space would cost them elsewhere. We also just turned out to them at that point and said, look, we've been given some money by Comic Relief. You've now got a complete period of rent-free throughout the lockdown and things like that. So it's more, I guess, you know, like say, being transparent about what kind of support the organisation was getting and how we can advocate for making sure they've still got a space to conduct their livelihoods from at the end of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think that all of that strategic work that was accelerated is really difficult to keep the momentum on, particularly over the last few months getting reopened. And I think, like Shoair said, the way to do it is to embed it throughout the organisation rather than it be a top level strategy. And that's, I suppose, the process that we've been going through over the last 10 months or so, is to sort of take some of these things and really embed them and start to make change as quickly as possible. I mean, we're doing a similar thing with transparency around pay and trying to create a rate card that's publicly available. And it will be painful, but it will be a starting point to which to grow on and to have a conversation. I think that's the big thing that I've sort of taken away, and I think the team have taken away, is that actually the more we can talk about these things, the more we can actually start to improve them and change them. And we've made commitment to do a 6-monthly update statement on our progress around equity, and included in that now is sort of paying for freelancers and including the staff team as well. So but yeah, I think that certainly recently keeping the momentum around that and challenging ourselves to find the space to do it, it is really, really hard, but it's something that we absolutely need to continue to do.
One of the real positives that came out was the way in which you all talked about kind of collegiality, collaboration, you know, kind of peer networks of support. And you're all here as people who are operating within Sussex. And I wondered if you have more to reflect on that, on the relationship between a kind of, you know, local, regional networks, national networks, international, you mentioned Shoair, international networks, because it's another interesting facet of the different dimensions in which you're operating and in which new relationships can emerge alongside kind of deepening and sustaining of existing relationships. Any reflection on kind of geographies and place?
I mean, it just made not being able to go to face-to-face meetings just made it much easier to go to meetings that you wouldn't normally go to. And I saw that with What Next or any kind of strategic group that people, you know, and anything we ran, whether it was training within our workforce or even just team meetings that involved all of the practitioners as well as the core team as well. there were just double the amount of people out there. And I suppose just that slow growing comfortableness with being in front of the screen talking to people, it just widened the conversation. We're part of a couple of cohorts there, but no need to go to details of, but just simply on a logistical level, just being easy to attend stuff, it linked people up better, I think.
And do you think that will carry on, or how can you make sure that carries on?
I just think it will, because people don't think twice now. People are probably more likely to think twice about travelling 2 hours to a 1 hour meeting.
Yeah.
And we all did that before.
Yeah.
You know.
And so we should think twice.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think there was, I mean, I noticed that it was quite interesting, some of the networks that were around the sector and peers very quickly got off the crisis mode into the how do we change things, which was really exciting. But I think other networks that were more embedded in local government or wider governmental focus were still stuck in a conversation of crisis and crisis management, and actually are still there in some cases. But the biggest challenge, I think, comes back to this whole concept of pay as well, was that a lot of those meetings didn't have very many freelancers from the sector in them because they couldn't afford to be there and take the time. And it's still an issue around actually, as organisational employees, we can take the time because we're paid to do so. But there's still a sort of challenge, I think, getting some of the freelancers in the sector to take part in them, and that needs to be recognised in those structures of thinking about pay.
I think that's a really good point, just which was one absolutely good point and really important point. We can now all access these meetings, but who is paid to be on them? And with the What Next process, we did raise funding so that the freelancers were paid to be part of the discussions. And that was really important. It probably wasn't enough, but it was important to do that. And I will certainly now, any future discussions I'm planning in any future role, I will expect to be able to pay freelancers for their time to be at meetings. In terms of physicality and of networks, it's interesting, isn't it? I felt almost more local than I felt in years, because and yet we were all doing this on screen, yet it felt incredibly connected to, because we were all trying to join up together to try and resolve things. So there's something interesting for me about actually how locally it was, how locally we were connected in a way we hadn't been. And Brighton is full of brilliant creative individuals and organisations, but I don't think we'd spent time together before. So there was something really interesting about that as a network. So I possibly didn't spend as much time kind of international networks, because there was a huge amount to do just to
I'm going to speak up for the in-person as well. And of course, the Zoom meetings do allow huge range of people to attend that wouldn't otherwise be able to. And I think there's a really important part of the kind of diversity of voices that come to those sorts of meetings. But there's also something about the magic of bouncing ideas in a physical space that maybe I just went to meetings that weren't brilliantly chaired. Maybe your meetings are better. But there's a kind of magic of idea creation that sometimes does happen face to face. Like, this is much more fun than if we were all sitting in our rooms with the dogs barking in the background. There's kind of magic of idea creation that happens with the physicality.
Yeah, but although I think operational meetings just don't need to be done in the same space. So I think there's a different type of meeting, isn't there, where that works. And I liked seeing the cats on Zoom. I think there was a great humanising of us all, actually. Really.
Washing in the background.
Yeah, well, they're not so much the washing, but you know, for people, if you're starting out and suddenly you're on a Zoom with people who are, you know, it can be quite intimidating to know who else is in the room. And actually, there was something very nice and human about those cats and kids.
I remember my first call with DCMS in the midst of the crisis. And I was kind of quite nervous going to that call. It was a senior level call. And the person I was talking to was kind of crouched in the corner of their bedroom because it was the best place they could get Wi-Fi. And then there was a real kind of reality of us as individuals that came from seeing your dirty laundry. Although Joe always has his towel in the bag. In the background.
I do.
It's always on brand.
The thing, I mean, I can't imagine that we would do the thing that we used to do before the crisis as well, which was to get an artist to travel, say from London to Eastbourne, an hour and 20 minutes for a 2-hour meeting, and then send them back. And we pay their train job, obviously, but just the idea of taking that freelancer's time to do that. Now, yeah, obviously for an idea session, it'd be really good, but for the operational side of developing a project, it's much better for them as well. I just can't imagine a time we would have that expectation of something like that as well.
Sure, what about you? You've already been working on those different registers, but has that changed?
Yeah, because we work nationally and internationally, and I guess it actually worked really well. You know, we hosted events and kind of portfolio reviews and workshops with participants from all around the world, which we never would have been able to afford to do before, actually. And now I'm kind of thinking about how we sustain those relationships, you know, with people in Guatemala, Costa Rica, South Africa. How do we then continue those relationships and at some point, hopefully have a physical connection? So I think we're going to move into a kind of operating system where a lot of it is remote, but then we have these moments of coming together. And that will be key.
Thank you. I wonder,
We've got one question.
we've got one question. I was just about to say, do we have any questions? So let's have the question that we have
So
there.
we need to wrap up very soon, but we've got one, which is, I mean, it's been, speaking personally, absolutely inspirational to hear about the kind of resilience, resourcefulness, imagination that you and your organisations have shown. If one thing could happen to enable you to get closer to the place that you want to end up, and I'm talking here, this could be as utopian as you like, what would that one change be that would enable your organisation or the arts or the cultural sector more generally to get to that better place?
A month's sabbatical.
Yeah.
A
year off.
But I think that's a really good point about the amount of space that we, you know, I think we're all slightly fearful that we will not have this time again. And of course, we've been working really, really hard and flat out through this year, but we haven't been doing some of the operational stuff. Right, we've been doing some of the operational stuff. And so, yeah, I vote on the an irregular month sabbatical or fortnight sabbatical. To have that headspace for strategic thinking and dreaming.
Yeah. I'm gonna go with this. I'm going back to my slow arts movement. Let's stop. Does the programme need to be as full as it was last year? I would ask us all to question whether we need to do as much in order that we can have the time to be inclusive, because it's a privilege to be busy as well. I think, you know, not everybody, in terms of diversity, not everybody is able to do that. So yeah, that was my one thing, is we slow down and we reduce the programme and therefore reduce impact and become more inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd echo the slowing down, definitely, and I think particularly thinking about the strategies coming from government, strategies coming from other places, I just think, you know, just slow it down across the board, because we are going to burn out and everybody's going to fall over. And we don't do our best work when we're in that state. So finding the space to just think about things and take the right decisions, or go and see an exhibition, you know, maybe that sort of thing would be nice. I think Nathaniel's point about getting back into the operations is doubly harder because all the staff are not used to it either, and getting back into the challenge, and we have all these restrictions imposed on us, which might not change next week, who knows. You know, it's sort of like, it has been exhausting and is continuing to be that way, and it looks like it isn't changing into the winter either. So, I mean, I'd agree with you. I think the expectation on delivery is enormous at the moment, and I think it comes back to that whole thing about high streets and, you know, the more things that the sectors are expected to deal with and work on in exchange for some money or whatever, then I think that's a real push, I think.
One thing.
Yeah, I think the one thing, so the pandemic has kind of disrupted the hierarchy of arts organisations. And the one thing I'd like not to happen is for it to immediately go back to that same pattern of hierarchy. I think we need to continue to challenge that and continue to kind of level out the playing field.
Fantastic. I think, Marina, your words of let's change the story, how do we change the story, were just fantastic. Thank you, stay with us. So thank you to all of our panellists. Thank you, live audience here actually with us, and those of you who joined us on Zoom. And hope that you're able to attend more of the events that the Festival of Ideas is running.